How's it going, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Corey, and today we're going to go over some more previews for the Brothers War. First up in today's list, we have Junkyard Genius. For 1, a black and a red, you get a 2/2 Human Artificer that says when it comes into the play, you get a tapped Power Stone token. It also has an ability for 1 black and a red and sacrifice another creature or artifact. You get to give all your other creatures +1/+0, menace, and haste until end of turn. This is the important part and the more interesting part of the card, because you can just give your entire squad a temporary boost, as well as anything you've just played, giving it haste. And then the big thing here is the menace part, because then it messes the combat math up for your opponent, because they might be like, well, I can block all this. Well, if you do this, no, you can't, and that extra damage might actually make the difference between winning and losing the game. Next up, I have Third Path Iconoclast. For a blue and a red, you get a 2/1 Human Monk that says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 soldier artifact creature token. Sorry about that. This is very similar to how Young Pyromancer works, where you cast spells to create elementals, but in this case, you're creating artifacts off of any non-creature spell that you cast. That's artifacts, enchantments, sorceries, instants, planeswalkers. Basically, the majority of spells you cast in any given game. So with this, you can load your board with artifacts, and then any kind of this artifacts matter stuff that's going on, this is going to really be a part of it. And then you can also kind of just pitch into this whole red-blue aggro thing that's going on, because we already have Balmor Battle Mage Captain out of DMU that's going to help pump these things as you're casting your instants and sorceries. So there's a good theme going on here, and I kind of like this for standard, and it will do probably a pretty good job in Commander as well. Here we have one of our new reprints that were revealed, Fauna Shaman. For 1 and a green, you get a 2/2 Elf Shaman, pay a green and tap, discard a creature card, search your library for a creature card, reveal it, and then put it into your hand and then shuffle. This is the creature version of Survival of the Fittest. And it has been needing a reprint for quite a while, at least a reasonable one. I think we've seen one in Secret Lair, but whoopee-doo. So in this case, we get a good, reasonable reprint of this card, and I think it might do some work in a lot of formats, especially Commander. Here we have a new card called Awaken the Woods. For X green, you have a sorcery that creates X 1/1 green forest dryad land creature tokens. We have Dryad Arbor, that is a 1/1 forest creature in the game. Well, this creates a bunch of copies of that, so you can either, tokens matter type synergies, things that copy tokens are really good here. Landfall triggers, however, is the big busted thing here. You can actually just get a bunch of landfall triggers, because these things count as lands when they come into play, and then you can stack them up. So you can get things like Lotus Cobra. You can just dump all your mana into this, have a Lotus Cobra on the board, hit it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I got all that mana back, and now I can cast other stuff during this turn. This is a card that's going to be really, really good in Legacy formats. This card was sort of spoiled the other day. People, I think, were just having wishful thinking on what it was, because they compared it to a card that has the same ability. This is Morel, Shield of Argive. For 3 and a white, you get a 3/4 human soldier that says during your turn, opponents cannot cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. So this locks them out of being able to stop you from doing anything, locks them out of counter magic, removal, whatever. And then it also has, whenever she attacks, create X 1/1 colorless soldier artifact tokens, where X is the number of soldiers you control. So this actually stacks up, where she's able to attack, hit your opponent, and create more and more of these things. So you're going to want to pack your deck with ways to keep her alive, either to bring her back if she dies in combat, ways to keep her indestructible, things of that nature, or just ways to pump her up so she survives in combat against a block. Whatever works. Here, speaking of soldiers, and this has become very apparent that blue-white soldiers is a thing in Standard coming up here. Skystrike Officer. For 2 and a blue, you get a 2/3 human soldier with flying that says when it attacks, create a 1/1 soldier artifact creature token, and you can tap 3 untapped soldiers you control to draw a card. This is compared online to Goblin Rabblemaster, but better, because 1, it flies, 2, it doesn't force all your other soldiers to attack like a Rebelmaster does for goblins, And this thing just, keeps churning out more and more soldiers. It flies, so it's harder to get rid of in blocking and combat. There's a bunch of different things about this that really sing to this. So I think this card is going to see a lot of play in Standard, and if soldier decks in Commander actually come up with anything, this will definitely be part of those decks. This has been discussed pretty well for the last couple of days online. Diabolic Intent. For 1 and a black, you get a sorcery where you have to sacrifice another creature in addition to cast a spell, but then you get to go tutor for whatever you want out of your deck. It's basically a quote-unquote fixed demonic tutor. This thing is really good. It sees a ton of play in Commander already with the previous 2 printings it had. It sees lots of play in other formats as well, or did back in the day anyways. But I think this is going to see a lot of play as just a good tutor in Standard. Pioneer finally gets a good, just straight 2-mana tutor. And sacrificing your creature in a lot of decks doesn't freaking matter. So I would keep an eye on this card. It's going to see play. Here we have Clay Champion. For X and 4, you get a 2/2 construct that says when it enters the battlefield, it gains 3+1/+1 counters on it for each double green you've spent to cast it, and when it enters the battlefield, choose up to 2 other target creatures you control. For each double white spent to cast it, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each of the 2 creatures you've selected. So, at worst, this is either a 8/8 for 4 green, a 2/2 that spreads 4 counters around if you have triple or quadruple white to cast it, or some mixture thereof, and it scales up because of the X cost. The X cost doesn't actually do anything like in terms of play here. It just makes it either makes the creature bigger as you're casting it, or it makes it so you can spread counters around. I think this is going to see a lot of play in Commander. There's just something about it that tells me that this is probably going to see a lot of play. Now, Standard, I'm not 100% certain. If there's ways to give it trample, you might see this in like a mono green stomp type build, because then you can crit an 8/8 for 4 just out of the blue, and then smash them in the teeth if you can give it trample. Takesha's Dig Site. It's just a land, taps for colorless, but the big thing here is pay 3, tap, Surveil 1. And if you don't know what Surveil is, you look at the top card, you can either put it back on top, or you can put it into your graveyard. Pretty straightforward. For the longest time, they did not want to keyword this ability, but with this set, they've brought it back as a keyword, and I believe it's now evergreen. So, if you don't have anything to do with your mana during a turn, Surveil. Dig a little deeper. Some decks you build around it, do graveyard shenanigans. This card works great for those kind of things. She's like, oh, there's a random target. Into the yard it goes. And then you just keep on going. Draconic Destiny. For 1 red, we have an enchantment aura, the dirty word, that says enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying haste, and pay a colorless. This creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and it is a dragon in addition to its other types. When the enchanted creature dies, return Draconic Destiny to its owner's hand. I know people do not like auras, but this is actually an interesting aura. You get to buff a creature up, turn it into a dragon, which has synergies with some certain cards in the formats. It has flying and haste, which is really good, and it gives it fire breathing, so you can pump it up, and then it allows you to get this thing back. So unlike most auras where you get 2 for 1 because the creature got shot in the face and then it just goes to the graveyard along with the creature, you actually get this thing back as long as they don't kill the creature in response to you enchanting it. Razorlash Transmogrant. It's a 2 colorless 3/1 artifact creature zombie that says it cannot block, and you can pay 4 black, return it to the battlefield from your graveyard with a counter on it. This ability costs 4 less to activate if an opponent controls 4 or more non-basic lands. This is probably not going to see a ton of play in Standard, unless there's some kind of weird 3/4 color deck that actually stands up and needs to have a bunch of non-basics to get its mana base rolled together right. It's probably not going to see a ton of play there, but in Commander and some other formats, this could be used, and you can get it back out of your graveyard for double black. And the fun part there is then it becomes a piece of a sacrifice tech for any kind of sacrifice decks that are out there. So I would keep an eye on this card. It may have some promise. Portal to Phyrexia. For 9 colorless, huge cost. you get an artifact that says when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. At the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It is a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. So this basically kills your opponent's creatures, and then you can resurrect them as Phyrexians on your side of the board, or you can just resurrect your own stuff because it says a graveyard, not an opponent's graveyard, or just yours. So you have some options there. It costs a lot, but the one thing that I think about here is there's a lot of ways to cheat things into play. You could surveil this into your graveyard and then use that new white sorcery that I talked about in my last video to bring it out of the graveyard and put it into the battlefield for 5 mana instead of 9. Or with all these Power Stone tokens that they're pushing, this could come out pretty early, like on turn 6. Now, there is a drawback to this, especially in things like Commander and like that. If your opponent's playing a bunch of tokens, this isn't going to do you a lot of good. They're just going to sacrifice tokens. They're not going to sacrifice a creature that you can steal from them or anything of consequence at any rate, unless they're running creature light, and it's kind of hard to tell what's going to happen there. So this could be really good, but I don't think it's going to be a huge player. Ashnod, Flesh Mechanist. For a black, you get a 1/1 human artificer with Death Touch that says whenever it attacks, you can sacrifice another creature, and if you do, create a tap Power Stone token. And then you can pay 5, exile a creature card from your graveyard, and create a 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token. See, I like this card because it's a way to sacrifice some of your cheap fodder stuff and create Power Stones to power up other things, including her ability. And on top of that, it's just kind of a fun lore thing because she's creating transmogrants, which were pretty much artifact zombies, where she merged the metal into their flesh and made these monstrous things. So I like this card. I think it has promise. It is just a 1/1, but they're going to have to lose a creature if they want to get rid of it. But there's some promise here. I'm not sure where. Maybe just as a commander, maybe? I'm not sure. So we'll see. Gixian Puppeteer. For 3 and a black, you get a Phyrexian Warlock. It's a 4/3 that says whenever you draw your second card each turn, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And when it dies, return another creature card from your graveyard with mana value 3 or less to the battlefield. So the big thing here is the draw trigger. I was discussing this online with someone yesterday, where you slam, in Commander in particular, you slam down like a Phyrexian Arena or a Black Market Connections, you're paying life to draw cards off of those, but with this on the board, you don't pay anything. And in case of the Arena, you're actually netting 1 life to get that extra card, because you're drawing the card from the trigger off the enchantment, and then you draw your card for the turn, and there you go, there's your second card, and you get the trigger off of this. I'm not sure how much play this is going to see inside of formats outside of Commander, but this thing has a lot of promise there. Mechanized Warfare. For 1 red, you get an enchantment that says if a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent they control, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. And we've seen this kind of effect before, mostly on red spells, where they'll deal an additional 1 damage as you go along. Well, the nice part here is with the artifacts, you got all of these little 1/1 soldier tokens being created that are colorless, and they're artifacts. So instead of being 1/1s, they're technically 2/1s as they deal their damage. So your opponent has to account for that. So there's going to be some kind of like red artifact, maybe with some white in it, maybe a Boros type thing in Standard that this might be really good in. I could see it seeing a lot of play in like a Brea Ethereum Shaper deck in Commander, because you're creating Thopters, and those Thopters will deal extra damage. So depending on how you build that deck, now that Commander is quite busted, but if you do a fair version of the deck, you could get away with making like a Thopter Tribal or Servo Tribal or something like that deals extra damage without being too busted. Now here's a translated card, so I'm not 100% certain the name is correct on this, but we'll see. It's called Over the Top. For 5 red, you get a sorcery. Each player reveals a number of cards from the top of their library equal to the number of non-land permanents they control, and then puts all permanent cards revealed this way onto the battlefield and the rest into their graveyard. This is Chaos incarnate. I love Chaos cards because you don't know what's going to happen in a game. So with this, if you have a bunch of stuff, you just all of a sudden flop over the top of your deck and be like, okay, here's all my permanents, and you can build a deck that's all about permanents. I've had basically an all permanents version of Vivictus, the Dire, where you pick a permanent off of each player and you make them sack it, and you flip the permanent off the top. Well, if you make your deck all permanents, you're always going to get a hit off your deck. Well, you could use this in a deck like that as like a one-off non-permanent spell, and you could flip this off the deck and be like, oops, I spit out all these permanents. I love this card. Misery Shadow. For 1 and a black, you get a 2/2 shade that says if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead, and pay a colorless, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So, ye old Nantuko Shade just got power crept to death. If you were around back then like I was, Nantuko Shade was a black 2/1 shade that said pay a black, give it +1/+1 until end of turn. On top of Corrupt being back in the format, we've basically almost got the recipe for mono black control to come back into the game. You have your Shade, you have your Corrupt. The only two things we're missing is a Mutilate variant and a Mirari variant to copy those Corrupts. We have plenty of removal, like single target removal. We have plenty of ways to make your opponent sacrifice stuff. There's a lot of good things here, and I'm going to keep an eye out on this in Standard to see if a mono black control deck can come back into the game that way. And on top of that, I think this just has a really relevant static ability to exile your opponent's creatures when they die, and that's good in just about any format. Next up, we have Cityscape Leveler. For 8 mana, you get an 8/8 construct with Trample that says when you cast the spell or when it attacks, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent, and its controller creates a tapped Power Stone token, and it has Unearth 8, which means you can play it out of your graveyard for 8 colorless. This is basically a strict upgrade to Meteor Golem. It's the same. Meteor Golem did the same thing, except for it was a 3/3 with no trample for 7 that blew up a non-land permanent when it came into play. Well, this is an 8/8 for 1 additional mana, has trample, and it's an 8/8. It's 5 extra power for 1 mana more. Yeah, this is just a straight up better Meteor Golem. It's going to see play as long as the Karn that gets you stuff out of your sideboard is not banned, because this will likely be in the sideboard of that deck. So you can go get it and just blow stuff up, and then you have a big fat 8/8 threat they gotta deal with. And if it gets killed, who cares? You unearth it and swing with it and destroy something else, and then they gotta deal with an 8/8 trample once again. This is just a really dumb card. Blade Coil Serpent, X and 6, you get a 5/4 Serpent, and it has, when it enters the battlefield, for every 2 blue spent to cast it, draw a card. For every 2 black spent to cast it, each opponent discards a card, and for every 2 red spent to cast it, it gets +1/+0, gains trample and haste until end of turn. Now, I don't really see the black and blue things being all that relevant. The thing I see on here is the red stuff. In Standard, this is basically an 8/4 trampling haste thing coming at your opponent. So if there's like a mono red deck out there, this will be the top end finisher for that deck. If you're playing Grixis in Commander, depending on how you build the deck, this could be a good heavy hitter there. But again, I don't see the card drawing and the discarding part being the most relevant thing. I actually see the red part being the most relevant here. So we'll see what happens. And then the last card for today, and this is another translation, Cerinthian Greatworm. For 4 red green, you have a 7/6 trampling worm that says whenever a land enters the battlefield, create a tap Power Stone token. Now, a lot of people will be like, well, why doesn't this say landfall on it? Read it closer. Whenever a land enters the battlefield. Landfall usually only triggers on your lands coming into play, under your control. This, however, says whenever a land, so when your opponents play a land, you get a Power Stone token for every land they play. Or I should say, every land they put into field. So if they go and use Harrow or Cultivate or whatever on their turn while this is out, every one of those fetched lands gets you about a Power Stone token. I can see a lot of things that you could use to bend this card a little bit. You could use Scape Shift, sack your lands, go get a bunch more, and you get a bunch of Power Stone tokens. There's a lot of limitless things you can mess around with this card, and I'm kind of interested to see how people thrash this card out. Well, that's all I have for today, folks. If you like what I'm doing here, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good fun YouTube stuff. It does help my channel grow. And don't think I've forgotten any of the prototype creatures, the milled stuff, any of those things, the commands. I'm going to actually do separate videos on those. They all have a lot of interest to me, but I want to kind of break down like what we can do with those special cards. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.